Mrs. Kapor sat by the window, her hands cradling a steaming cup of tea, its warmth seeping into her palms. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the quiet street outside. Her garden, a patch of vibrant colors and lush greenery, seemed to bask in the light, as if it, too, were savoring the tranquility of the moment. She had lived in this house for over 3 decades, a place that had witnessed the ebb and flow of her life, its joys, its sorrows, its quiet triumphs. For the past 5 years, she had been a widow, her days marked by a solitude that was both comforting and, at times, achingly lonely. The house was a repository of memories, each room holding fragments of a life once shared with her late husband. Some memories brought a smile to her lips, while others carried the weight of unspoken grief. Yet as the years passed, Mrs. Capor had found solace in the rhythms of her daily life. The familiar faces of her neighbors, the gentle hum of activity outside her window, and the quiet companionship of her plants, which she tended to with unwavering care. Still, there was an emptiness within her, a longing for something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the absence of her husband, though his loss had left an indelible void. It was something more elusive, a yearning for connection, for a sense of purpose that seemed to have slipped through her fingers as the years went by. She often found herself gazing out at the street, her thoughts wandering, as if searching for answers in the stillness of the afternoon. One such afternoon, as she stood in her garden, pruning her roses with practiced hands, she noticed him again, Jacob, the young man who lived next door. He was in his mid-20s with a carefree demeanor that seemed to radiate an effortless charm. She had seen him often, strumming his guitar on his porch or tinkering in his yard, his movements unhurried, his presence a quiet constant in the neighborhood. There was something about him that intrigued her, though she couldn't quite put it into words. Perhaps it was the way he seemed so at ease with himself, so unburdened by the weight of expectations. Or perhaps it was the music he played, simple melodies that carried a sense of calm, as if they were meant to soothe not just the listener, but the world itself. They had never spoken much, save for the occasional polite greeting when their paths crossed. Yet there was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement that lingered in the air whenever their eyes met. Mrs. Kapor often found herself watching him from the corner of her eye, her curiosity piqued by his presence. She wondered about his life, his dreams, his struggles, but she never ventured to ask, content to let their connection remain undefined, a quiet thread woven into the fabric of their shared existence. It was a Saturday when he finally came over. Mrs. Capor was in her garden, her hands buried in the soil as she tended to her roses. The sun was warm on her back, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. She was lost in thought when she heard a knock at the door. Startled, she wiped her hands on her apron and made her way to the front of the house. When she opened the door, she found Jacob standing there, a small basket of fresh oranges in his hands. His eyes met hers, and for a moment there was an awkward silence, as if neither of them knew quite what to say. "These are from my tree," he said finally, breaking the silence with a smile. "I thought you might like them." Mrs. Capor hesitated for a moment, taken aback by the gesture. Then she smiled back, her heart warming at his thoughtfulness. "That's very kind of you, Jacob. Come in, I'll make us some tea." Jacob stepped inside, his guitar slung across his back. Mrs. Capor led him to the kitchen, where they sat together at the small table, sipping tea and talking about nothing in particular. The conversation was light, effortless, as if they had known each other for years. They spoke of the weather, the garden, the neighborhood, mundane topics that carried a quiet comfort. Yet beneath the surface, there was something more, a sense of connection that neither of them could quite articulate. Over time, these small visits became more frequent. Jacob would come over with fresh produce from his garden, help her with odd jobs around the house, or simply sit with her in the garden, strumming his guitar. There was no hurry in their conversations, no need for deep words or grand gestures. They simply enjoyed each other's company, finding solace in the quiet moments they shared. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Capor found herself looking forward to Jacob's visits. It wasn't just the pleasant company or the help he offered around the house. It was the sense of connection she hadn't felt in years, the feeling of being seen and understood. Jacob, for his part, began to open up to her about his life. He spoke of his struggles, his failed relationships, and the pain of lost opportunities. His words were raw and honest, carrying a vulnerability that touched Mrs. Kapor deeply. In return, she shared her own stories, though they were often fragmented, wrapped in the soft warmth of nostalgia. She spoke of her late husband, their life together, and the quiet sorrow of losing him. Yet there was no sadness when they spoke, only understanding, a shared recognition of the complexities of life and love. One evening, as they sat in the garden, the fading light of the day painting everything in soft shades of pink and orange, Jacob had his guitar with him again. He was gently plucking the strings, the music swirling around them like a gentle breeze. Mrs. Kapor leaned back in her chair, her eyes closed, letting the melody wash over her. "What's that song?" she asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper. Jacob paused, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "It's something I wrote. It's about the things we never say, the things we wish we could." He looked at her as if trying to see if she understood, and she did. They sat in silence for a while, the music filling the space between them with something unspoken. For a moment it felt as if time had stopped, and they were both suspended in the melody. Mrs. Kapor realized that, in a way, Jacob was right. Sometimes the most important things were the words left unspoken. It was in those quiet moments that they truly understood each other. One day, after several weeks of these visits, Jacob found himself telling her more about his past. He had been in love once, but the relationship had ended in heartbreak. "You never really get over someone like that," he said quietly, looking down at the guitar in his hands. "It stays with you, you know." Mrs. Kapor nodded, her heart aching for him. She knew that kind of love, the kind that stayed with you long after the person was gone. She had lost her own love years ago, but the memory lingered, always. "I know," she whispered. "I lost my husband years ago. He was my heart, my everything, and now there's a space where he used to be." Jacob looked up at her then, and their eyes met. There was no need for more words. They had both shared something deeply personal, something raw and vulnerable, and in that moment, they found solace in each other's presence. Over the next few months, their friendship deepened. They shared more stories, more silences, and more moments of understanding. There were no grand gestures, no declarations of love, but there was something quiet and steady between them, a connection that neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. Mrs. Kapor had never imagined her life would take this turn, to find someone who understood her in the way Jacob did. And Jacob, too, found comfort in the older woman's wisdom, her quiet strength. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out, Jacob turned to Mrs. Kapor. "I never imagined I'd be sitting here with someone like you," he said softly. Mrs. Kapor smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "And I never imagined I'd find someone like you," she replied. Their gazes met, and for the first time, there was a soft, lingering silence between them, filled with the weight of unspoken words. They didn't need to say anything more. They both knew that whatever this connection was, it was enough. As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of Mrs. Kapoor's life. There was a new lightness in her step, a quiet joy that had been missing for years. Jacob's visits became something she looked forward to every day. It wasn't just about the tea or the small favors he did around the house anymore. It was about the comfort of his presence, the conversations that flowed easily between them, and the shared understanding of two people who had both experienced love and loss. One morning, as she sat in her living room, Mrs. Kapor found herself thinking about the past, about how different life had been before Jacob's arrival. Her world had once been small and still, defined by routine and solitude, but now it was full of light and possibility. Jacob had brought an unexpected warmth into her life, like a sunbeam breaking through the clouds after a storm. She thought about the way he played his guitar in the evenings, the way he would laugh at her stories or gently tease her about her tendency to add extra sugar to her tea. It was the little things that made all the difference. The way he looked out for her, the way his presence made her feel seen, as though she mattered. She hadn't realized how long it had been since someone had made her feel that way. That evening, as they sat together on the porch again, Jacob strummed his guitar softly, his fingers moving with ease over the strings. The evening air was cool, and the sky was a deep shade of indigo, dotted with stars. Mrs. Capor watched him, her heart full of quiet affection. She had never expected to find a connection like this at her age, never imagined that someone so much younger could come to mean so much to her. "Jacob," she said, her voice tentative, "I've been thinking." He stopped playing and looked at her, his expression gentle. "About what?" "About us," she said, her words soft but deliberate. "I never thought I would have this kind of friendship at my age, but you've brought something into my life that I didn't know I was missing. It's more than just company, it's a kind of peace." Jacob smiled, his eyes warm. "I feel the same way," he said quietly. "I didn't expect to find someone like you either, but I'm glad I did." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. It wasn't a silence of awkwardness or uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that came from two people who had found something precious in each other, something deeper than friendship but not yet fully defined. As the weeks turned into months, Mrs. Caper began to notice how much she had come to rely on Jacob, how much his presence had become a part of her life. She found herself waking up each day with a sense of anticipation, wondering when he would arrive, what new song he might play, or what story he might share. He had become a constant in her world, a source of comfort and connection. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Jacob put down his guitar and turned to her with a serious expression. "Mrs. Capor," he began, "I've been thinking about something for a while now." She raised an eyebrow, sensing the change in his tone. "What is it, Jacob?" He hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "I know we've been spending a lot of time together, and I've come to care about you a lot, but I need to be honest with you. I've realized that what I feel for you goes beyond friendship. I, I think I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, thick with emotion. Mrs. Capor felt a mixture of surprise and warmth. She had never expected this moment to come, never imagined that Jacob's feelings for her might be anything more than the deep connection they had shared. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the sincerity there, the vulnerability that came with admitting something so raw and honest. She took a deep breath, her heart racing. "Jacob," she said softly, I, I don't know what to say. I never imagined I would feel this way again. But I do care for you, more than I can explain. You've become such an important part of my life." There was a pause, a moment where neither of them spoke. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for them to find the words that would define this moment. Mrs. Capor's heart ached with the knowledge that this was a turning point in their relationship, a moment where everything could change. Finally, Jacob spoke again, his voice low but steady. "I understand if you don't feel the same way, Mrs. Capor. I just needed you to know how I feel." She looked at him, her eyes soft with affection. "Jacob, I do feel the same. I'm just scared. I'm afraid of what this could mean, of how complicated it could get." Jacob nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I know it's complicated, but sometimes the things that are the most complicated are also the most worth it." Mrs. Caper felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to feel this way again, to open herself up to the possibility of love when so much of her life had been about letting go. But Jacob had awakened something in her that she thought was long lost, a desire to feel truly seen, to be loved in a way that wasn't tied to the past but to the present. "I'm not sure what the future holds," she said softly, her voice trembling, "but I want to see where this takes us. Together." Jacob's eyes lit up, a soft smile spreading across his face. "Together," he repeated, as if savoring the word. He reached for her hand, and she took it, their fingers intertwining in the quiet stillness of the evening. And so, in the days that followed, Mrs. Capor and Jacob took their first tentative steps into something new, something neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was real, and it was theirs. They didn't need grand declarations or sweeping gestures. They simply needed each other, in the quiet moments, in the shared silences. For the first time in years, Mrs. Caper felt truly alive, her heart full of possibility and love. And in Jacob, she had found not just a companion, but a partner, someone who saw her for who she was, not for her age or her past. Their story was just beginning, and they knew it was one they would write together, with each passing day.